Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance, watching the stars through the main viewing screen, and felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders, like an old coat that never quite fit right but had become comfortable over the years. The ship hummed around him with the quiet efficiency of humanity's most advanced warship, and he could hear the soft conversations of his crew as they went about their duties during what should have been another routine deep space patrol in the outer edges of human territory, where the galaxy still held its secrets close and refused to give them up easily. Lieutenant Lisa Carter looked up from her science station with the kind of expression that usually meant she had found something interesting or dangerous or both, which in Jake's experience were often the same thing when you were this far from home and surrounded by the endless dark between stars. Her fingers danced across the control panels as she analyzed the readings that were coming in from the long-range sensors, and Jake could see the puzzle forming in her mind as she tried to make sense of what the instruments were telling her about. Something that shouldn't exist in this empty region of space. Captain, we're picking up massive energy signatures, about 2 light hours ahead of our current position, and they don't match anything in our database, Lisa said without looking away from her instruments as more data flowed across her screens, in streams of numbers and graphs that painted a picture of something vast and powerful waiting in the darkness ahead of them, like a sleeping giant that had been disturbed from its ancient dreams. The bridge fell quiet except for the steady hum of the ship's systems, and Jake could feel the attention of his crew focusing on him as they waited for orders, and he found himself thinking about how far they were from Earth and back up, and wondering if they were about to make first contact with something that would change everything humanity thought it knew about their place in the universe. Commander Ryan Torres stepped closer to the tactical console, and his experienced hands moved over the weapon controls with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years preparing for battles that might never come but always could, and Jake saw the way his shoulders tensed as he studied the readings that were painting themselves across his displays in patterns that spoke of ships and technology, beyond anything humanity had yet encountered in their slow expansion into the galaxy. So the energy patterns suggest multiple large vessels, possibly dozens of them, and they're arranged in what looks like a defensive formation around something even bigger, Ryan reported, and his voice carried the careful neutrality of a professional soldier who had learned to keep his emotions locked away when duty called, but Jake could hear the underlying tension that came from facing the unknown with nothing but training and determination to guide them forward. Navigation Officer Kelly Brooks turned in her seat to face the captain, and her young face showed the excitement and fear that came with being part of something that would be written about in history books if they lived long enough to file their reports. Captain, the formation is blocking our planned route through this system, and if we want to continue our patrol mission, we'll need to go around them or make contact, she said, and Jake could see her calculating distances and fuel consumption in her head as she tried to find alternatives that might not exist. Chief Engineer Tony Martinez spoke up from the engineering station where he had been monitoring the ship's systems and making the small adjustments that kept everything running smoothly in the harsh environment of deep space. So the Defiance is running at peak efficiency, and all our experimental systems are functioning within normal parameters, so if we do encounter trouble, we should be able to handle whatever comes our way, he said with the confidence of someone who understood every bolt and circuit in the ship that had become their home and their weapon and their shield against the dangers of the unknown. Jake moved to stand behind Lisa's station and looked down at the sensor readings that showed energy signatures unlike anything in human space, and he felt the familiar tingle of anticipation that came before major decisions that would ripple outward through time and space to touch lives that hadn't even been born yet. The alien vessels were massive beyond anything humanity had built, and their energy output suggested technology that was centuries ahead of human science, but they showed no signs of movement or aggression, which might mean peaceful contact or might mean they were so powerful they didn't consider the Defiance a threat worth acknowledging. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission," Communications Officer Amanda Foster announced, and her voice carried a note of wonder as she adjusted her equipment to handle signals that were coming in on frequencies and in formats that pushed the limits of their communication systems. The main screen flickered and changed to show beings of pure light and energy that seemed to pulse with their own internal radiance as they spoke in voices that resonated with harmonics that made the bridge speakers vibrate and filled the air with sounds that were almost music. They called themselves the Eternal Shepherds and claimed to be divine beings who had come to guide humanity into a greater understanding of their place in the cosmic order, and their words carried weight and authority that seemed to press against the minds of everyone who heard them like a gentle but insistent hand pushing them toward acceptance and submission. The beings who called themselves the Eternal Shepherds continued their transmission, and Jake felt a strange pressure building behind his eyes as their voices washed over the bridge like a tide of liquid starlight that wanted to carry away all thoughts of resistance or doubt. The creatures spoke of their divine mission to bring order to the chaos of the galaxy and guide lesser species toward enlightenment, but something in their tone made Jake's skin crawl even as part of his mind whispered that maybe they were right. And maybe humanity should listen to these ancient powers who had been traveling the stars since before Earth's sun was born. Lisa Carter shook her head sharply and pressed her hands against her temples as she fought against the mental pressure that seemed to be growing stronger with each word the alien spoke. Her scientific training kicked in, and she began running scans on her own brain patterns and those of the crew around her, while the instruments recorded energy frequencies that were definitely affecting human neural activity in ways that suggested these beings were using some form of telepathic manipulation to reinforce their claims of divine authority. "Captain, something's not right about this," Lisa managed to say through gritted teeth as she forced herself to focus on the sensor readings instead of the hypnotic voices that were promising peace and purpose under the guidance of beings who had supposedly transcended the limitations of mortal existence. "I'm detecting low-level psychic emissions that are designed to make us more receptive to their message and less likely to question their authority." Ryan Torres found his hand moving toward the weapon controls without his conscious decision, and he had to force himself to pull back as he realized that the aliens were somehow influencing his thoughts and making him want to either attack immediately or surrender completely. His military training had prepared him for many things, but not for enemies who could reach inside his mind and twist his own thoughts against him like a knife made of his own doubts and fears. The transmission changed and showed images of worlds across the galaxy where other species knelt before the Eternal Shepherds in worship and gratitude for the peace and order that had been brought to their chaotic lives. Cities of crystal and light stretched across continents, while beings of dozens of different shapes and sizes worked together in perfect harmony under the gentle guidance of their divine protectors who watched over them like benevolent parents, caring for children who didn't yet understand the complexities of galactic civilization. Kelly Brooks tried to focus on her navigation controls, but found herself staring at the images of peaceful worlds where war and hunger and disease had been eliminated by the wisdom of beings who had mastered the secrets of existence itself. Part of her mind began calculating what it would mean for humanity to join this galactic community and leave behind the struggles and conflicts that had marked their entire history as a species slowly climbing toward the stars. These worlds look like paradise, Amanda Foster whispered as she watched the images flow across her communication screens and felt the pull of voices that promised an end to all the pain and uncertainty that came with being human in a universe that often seemed hostile to life itself. "Maybe we should consider what they're offering instead of automatically assuming they mean us harm." Tony Martinez felt his engineering instincts rebelling against the perfect harmony shown in the alien transmission because his experience told him that complex systems always had flaws and inefficiencies, and the idea of perfect order without conflict or struggle went against everything he understood about how the universe actually worked. He began running diagnostic scans on the ship's systems to make sure the alien transmission wasn't affecting their equipment the same way it was affecting their minds. Jake forced himself to take a step back from the mesmerizing display and tried to think clearly about what was happening to his crew and his ship, while voices that claimed to speak with the authority of gods told him that resistance was futile and submission was the only path to true peace. His command training had taught him to be suspicious of anyone who claimed to have all the answers, and the fact that these beings were using mental manipulation to reinforce their message only made him more determined to resist their influence. All. Stop. Jake ordered, and his voice cut through the alien transmission like a blade through silk as he reasserted his authority over his own bridge and his own crew. Amanda, cut that transmission, and Lisa, I want a full analysis of those psychic emissions and how they're affecting our people. The screen went dark, and the oppressive mental pressure began to fade as the crew of the Defiance shook off the effects of the alien mind control and looked around at each other with expressions of confusion and anger at having their thoughts manipulated without their consent. Jake could see his people struggling to separate their own feelings from the artificial emotions that had been planted in their minds by beings who claimed to be divine but were clearly not above using deception and mental coercion to achieve their goals. Sir, the alien fleet is moving toward our position, and their energy signatures are increasing, Ryan reported as his tactical displays showed the massive ships breaking formation and beginning to close the distance between them and the lone human vessel that had dared to resist their divine authority. I count 37 ships of various sizes, and they're powering up what appear to be weapon systems. Lisa worked frantically at her science station as she analyzed the data they had collected during the transmission and discovered that the aliens were indeed using sophisticated telepathic technology to influence the thoughts and emotions of other species, but human brain patterns showed unusual resistance to these effects, which explained why they had been able to break free from the mental manipulation that had probably overwhelmed every other species these creatures had encountered. Captain Human neural structure appears to be naturally resistant to their psychic control methods, Lisa reported with growing excitement as she realized the implications of her discovery. We're not completely immune, but we can fight it off with conscious effort, which means we might be the first species they've encountered that can resist their primary method of control. The alien fleet continued its approach, and Jake could see on the tactical display that they were moving with the slow confidence of beings who had never encountered serious resistance to their authority and expected this encounter to end the same way all the others had, with submission and worship from another species that would join their growing empire of devoted followers who believed their conquerors were actually divine saviors. The first alien ship to reach weapons range was a crystalline vessel that seemed to be carved from a single piece of some translucent material that caught and reflected the light of distant stars in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jake watched it approach on the main screen and found himself thinking that it looked more like a work of art than a warship, which might explain why these beings had relied so heavily on mental manipulation instead of actual combat to build their empire across the galaxy. Ryan Torres studied his tactical readings and noticed that the alien ships were moving in formations that were beautiful to watch, but tactically unsound by human military standards. Their approach was ceremonial rather than practical, and they seemed more concerned with making an impressive display than with maximizing their combat effectiveness, which suggested they were used to enemies who surrendered at the first show of force rather than fighting back with everything they had. So they're charging some kind of energy weapon, but the power levels are relatively low compared to what their ships should be capable of, Ryan reported as he tracked the approaching vessels and prepared the Defiance's defensive systems for whatever was coming. It looks like they're planning to disable us rather than destroy us, which fits with their pattern of trying to capture intact ships and crews for conversion to their cause. Lisa Carter continued her analysis of the alien technology and discovered that their ships were powered by systems that were incredibly advanced but also incredibly old, with design patterns that suggested they hadn't been significantly updated or improved for centuries. The beings who built them had apparently reached a level of technological development that satisfied their needs and then stopped innovating, which might be a weakness that humanity could exploit if they were clever enough to figure out how. That alien ship fired its weapon, and a beam of pure energy struck the Defiance's shields with a sound like singing crystal that resonated through the hull and made the lights flicker for a moment before the experimental quantum shielding adapted to the new energy frequency and began deflecting the attack. Jake felt a surge of pride in his ship and his crew as their advanced technology proved capable of handling whatever these ancient beings could throw at them. "Shields holding at 90%, Tony Martinez reported from his engineering station, as he monitored the ship's defensive systems and made real-time adjustments to optimize their performance against the alien weapons. "Sir, the quantum shielding is actually getting stronger as it analyzes and adapts to their energy patterns, and I think we might be able to absorb a lot more punishment than they're expecting." Kelly Brooks began evasive maneuvers that took advantage of the Defiance's superior speed and agility compared to the massive alien vessels that were built for intimidation rather than dogfighting. She wove between the crystalline ships with a grace that seemed to surprise their crews, who were probably used to dealing with enemies that either surrendered immediately or fought from fixed positions. While overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower, the aliens increased their rate of fire and more energy beams lanced out toward the human ship, but the Defiance danced between them like a minnow swimming between the fingers of giants who couldn't quite grasp something so small and quick and determined to survive. Jake could see on his tactical display that the alien formation was beginning to break apart as individual ships tried to track his vessel's unpredictable movements. "Amanda, are you picking up any communication between their ships?" Jake asked as he watched his crew work together with the kind of seamless coordination that came from months of training and shared danger in the depths of space where mistakes could kill everyone aboard before help could arrive from the distant worlds of human civilization. "Yes, sir, and it sounds like they're confused and frustrated," Amanda replied as she monitored the alien communication channels and tried to make sense of languages that had evolved on worlds where the dominant species had been worshipping these beings as gods for thousands of years. "They keep referring to us as an anomaly and asking each other why their divine authority isn't working on the humans." Ryan Torres found his opening when two of the alien ships moved too close together while trying to bracket the Defiance, and he fired the ship's main railgun at the nearer target. The tungsten projectile accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed and struck the crystalline hull with kinetic energy that no amount of advanced shielding could completely deflect because physics was still physics. No matter how technologically advanced the civilization became, the alien ship shattered like glass, struck by a hammer, and debris scattered in all directions, while the surviving crew members were presumably picked up by other vessels in their fleet. The destruction of one of their supposedly invincible ships sent shock waves through the alien formation, and Jake could see their perfect order beginning to dissolve into something approaching panic as they realized they were facing an enemy that could actually hurt them. "Direct hit and the target is completely destroyed," Ryan reported with satisfaction as he began targeting the next alien ship and prepared to demonstrate that humanity was not going to submit to beings who claimed divine authority but bled and died like any other mortal creatures when faced with weapons designed by people who understood that survival sometimes required the willingness to fight against impossible odds. Lisa Carter was analyzing the debris from the destroyed ship, and her readings showed that the crystalline material was indeed some kind of advanced composite that was incredibly strong under normal circumstances but became brittle when subjected to the kind of kinetic impact that human weapons were designed to deliver. "Captain, their hull material has a critical weakness to high-velocity impacts, and our railguns should be able to punch through their defenses if we can hit them." The remaining alien ships began to spread out and change their attack patterns as they adapted to the realization that they were dealing with an enemy that not only refused to acknowledge their divinity but possessed weapons that could actually threaten their supposedly invincible vessels. Jake could see confusion and doubt beginning to replace the serene confidence that had marked their initial approach, and he realized that these beings might not have faced a real challenge to their authority for so long that they had forgotten how to fight a determined enemy. Tony Martinez rerouted power to the ship's weapons and propulsion systems while monitoring the quantum shielding that continued to adapt and strengthen as it analyzed more of the alien energy patterns. "Sir, all Systems are operating within acceptable parameters, and we're ready for whatever they want to throw at us next. The alien fleet regrouped, and Jake could see on his tactical display that they were no longer treating this as a simple demonstration of divine power, but as an actual battle that required real strategy and coordination to win. The crystalline ships formed new attack patterns that were more aggressive and showed signs of actual military thinking rather than the ceremonial approaches they had used earlier when they expected the humans to surrender at the first show of force. More alien vessels appeared on the long-range sensors as reinforcements arrived from deeper in their territory, and Jake realized they were now facing odds that would have been impossible for any conventional human fleet to overcome. The new ships were larger and more heavily armed than the first group, and their energy signatures suggested weapons that could probably overwhelm even the Defiance's advanced shielding if they all fired at once in a coordinated attack. Sir, we're now tracking over 200 alien vessels of various sizes, and more are arriving every few minutes, Ryan Torres reported as he studied the tactical situation and began calculating firing solutions that would give them the best chance of survival against overwhelming numbers. They're deploying in a sphere formation that will make it impossible for us to escape if they complete the encirclement. Lisa Carter continued, analyzing the alien technology, and discovered something interesting about the way their ships communicated with each other through a form of quantum entanglement that allowed instantaneous coordination across vast distances. The system was elegant and efficient, but it also had a potential weakness because all the ships were linked together in a network that might be vulnerable to the right kind of interference or attack. Captain, I think their communication system might be their weak point, Lisa said as she worked at her science station and tried to understand the complex quantum relationships that bound the alien fleet together. If we could disrupt their network, they might lose the ability to coordinate their attacks, and we could pick them off one by one instead of fighting the entire fleet at once. Kelly Brooks pushed the Defiance to its maximum speed as she tried to stay ahead of the closing alien formation while looking for gaps in their coverage that might allow the human ship to break free and escape to fight another day. The alien vessels were faster than they looked, and their coordination was improving as more ships joined the battle and added their computational power to the collective effort to capture or destroy the defiant humans. Amanda Foster intercepted more alien communications and discovered that they were calling in ships from across their empire to deal with what they were now referring to as a significant threat to their divine authority. The messages revealed that this was the first time in centuries that any species had successfully resisted their initial contact protocols and destroyed one of their vessels in combat. Sir, they're treating us as a major threat to their entire empire, Amanda reported as she listened to communications that spoke of emergency meetings and strategic planning sessions that were being held on worlds hundreds of light years away. It sounds like our resistance is causing panic among their leadership, and they're afraid that other species might follow our example if they can't crush us quickly and decisively. The alien fleet completed its encirclement and began closing in on the Defiance from all directions while their largest ships moved into position to deliver a coordinated attack that would overwhelm the human vessel's defenses through sheer volume of fire. Jake could see that they had learned from their earlier mistakes and were now fighting like a real military force, instead of relying on intimidation and divine authority to achieve their goals. Ryan Torres fired the ship's weapons at every opportunity and managed to damage several more alien vessels, but the numbers were simply too overwhelming for one ship to handle, no matter how advanced its technology or how skilled its crew. The railgun projectiles found their targets and shattered crystalline hulls, but for every ship they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. As reinforcements continued to arrive from across the alien empire, Tony Martinez rerouted power from non-essential systems to keep the shields and weapons functioning at maximum efficiency, but even the Defiance's advanced technology had limits, and those limits were being approached as the alien fleet concentrated its fire on the lone human vessel. Sir, shield strength is down to 60% and falling as they focus more firepower on our position. The alien attacks were becoming more sophisticated as they adapted their tactics to counter human defensive measures, and Jake realized that these beings were not as dependent on their mental manipulation abilities as he had initially thought. They were capable of learning and adapting to new threats, which made them far more dangerous than enemies who relied only on overwhelming force or superior technology. Lisa Carter made a breakthrough in her analysis of the alien communication network and discovered that it was vulnerable to a specific type of quantum interference that the Defiance's experimental systems could generate. Captain, I think I can disrupt their coordination network, but it will require channeling all our shield power through the quantum generators, which means we'll be defenseless for at least 30 seconds while the system recalibrates. Jake looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew and saw the determination and trust that had carried them through countless dangerous missions in the depths of space, where humanity was still learning what it meant to be part of a galaxy filled with wonders and terrors beyond imagination. "Do it," he said simply, and watched as Lisa began the complex process of converting their defensive systems into a weapon that could strike at the very heart of the alien Empire's coordination and control. The alien fleet sensed that something was changing in the human ship's energy patterns and increased their rate of fire as they tried to destroy the Defiance before whatever the humans were planning could be completed. Energy beams and exotic particle weapons struck the ship's hull directly as the shields went down, and Jake felt the Defiance shudder under the impact of weapons that could have vaporized entire cities on the worlds these beings claimed to protect. And guide dot sparks flew from damaged control panels, and the lights flickered as the ship's systems struggled to maintain power distribution while being hammered by attacks from hundreds of alien vessels that were determined to crush this symbol of resistance before it could inspire other species to question the divine authority that had kept their empire stable for millennia. The quantum interference pulse erupted from the Defiance like a silent scream that raced outward at the speed of light and struck the alien communication network with the force of a digital hurricane that tore through their carefully maintained quantum entanglement systems. Lisa Carter watched her instruments with fierce concentration as the pulse spread through the enemy fleet and began disrupting the connections that allowed hundreds of ships to fight as a single coordinated entity. The effect was immediate and dramatic as alien vessels suddenly found themselves cut off from their central command structure and unable to coordinate their attacks with the precision that had made their empire so successful for thousands of years. Ships collided with each other as they lost the ability to track their neighbors' positions and movements, while others fired wildly in all directions as their targeting systems struggled to function without the shared data that had guided them only moments before. Jake felt the Defiance's shields come back online as Tony Martinez rerouted power from the quantum generators and began emergency repairs on the systems that had been damaged during their brief period of vulnerability. Smoke filled parts of the bridge and several crew members sported burns from exploding consoles, but everyone was still alive and ready to continue the fight against enemies who claimed divine authority but bled just like any other mortals when their technology failed them. "Sir, the alien fleet is in complete chaos," Ryan Torres reported with satisfaction as he watched enemy ships struggling to reorganize themselves without their communication network to guide them. "Their formation has completely collapsed, and they're firing on each other as much as they're firing at us because they can't tell friend from foe without their coordination systems." Kelly Brooks took advantage of the confusion to maneuver the Defiance through gaps in the alien formation that opened up as ships drifted out of position or tried to avoid collisions with their own allies. The human ship moved like a predator. Among prey as it picked off isolated enemy vessels that found themselves cut off from support and unable to call for help from their scattered comrades. Amanda Foster monitored the alien communication channels and discovered that panic was spreading through their fleet as commanders tried to reestablish contact with their subordinates and coordinate a response to the human attack that had crippled their most basic operational systems. "Captain, they're broadcasting emergency signals in all directions, and it sounds like they've never encountered anything like this before." The largest alien ship in the fleet began moving toward the Defiance with obvious hostile intent, as its commander apparently decided that individual action was better than waiting for the communication network to be restored. The massive vessel was easily 10 times the size of the human ship, and its energy signatures suggested weapons that could probably destroy the Defiance with a single direct hit if they managed to target accurately without computer assistance. Lisa Carter analyzed the approaching dreadnought and discovered that it was using an older and more primitive communication system that had apparently been unaffected by the quantum interference pulse. "Sir, that big ship is still fully operational, and it's trying to coordinate the scattered elements of their fleet using backup communication methods that weren't connected to their main network." Ryan Torres targeted the alien dreadnought with everything the Defiance had and fired a full spread of railgun projectiles that streaked across space like silver meteors, seeking their target with deadly precision. The tungsten slugs struck the massive ship's crystalline hull and punched through defenses that had been designed to stop energy weapons rather than kinetic projectiles traveling at relativistic speeds. The alien dreadnought staggered under the impact but remained operational as its crew fought to maintain control of their damaged vessel while returning fire with weapons that lit up space around the Defiance like an artificial aurora. The battle between the two ships became a deadly dance as Kelly Brooks used every trick of maneuvering she knew to keep them alive, while Ryan Torres systematically destroyed the enemy ship's weapon systems one by one. Tony Martinez worked frantically to keep the Defiance's systems operational as alien weapons found their mark and damaged critical components throughout the ship. Emergency lighting flickered on and off as power distribution networks struggled to route energy around damaged circuits, while backup systems came online to replace functions that had been knocked out by enemy fire. The alien dreadnought began to list to one side as multiple railgun hits compromised its structural integrity and caused massive internal explosions that could be seen through tears in its crystalline hull. Jake could see smaller alien ships beginning to regroup as their commanders adapted to fighting without their advanced communication systems, but many of them were focusing their attacks on their own flagship in their confusion and panic. "Sir, the big ship is breaking up," Ryan reported as his instruments tracked the progressive failure of the enemy dreadnought's main structure. "Internal explosions are spreading throughout the vessel, and I don't think they're going to be able to save it." The alien flagship exploded in a burst of light that was visible for light years in all directions as its matter-antimatter containment systems failed and released energies that had been carefully controlled for centuries of peaceful operation. The shockwave from the explosion scattered the remaining alien ships and seemed to break the spirit of resistance among crews who had believed their vessels were blessed by divine protection. Lisa Carter detected new signals on her instruments as the surviving alien ships began broadcasting surrender messages in dozens of different languages that represented the many species that served in their fleet. "Captain, I'm receiving transmission from multiple alien vessels, and they all seem to be offering to surrender to us rather than continue a fight they can no longer hope to win." Amanda Foster translated the surrender messages and discovered that many of the alien crews were not members of the species that claimed to be gods, but rather representatives of subject races that had been forced to serve in the fleet against their will. "Sir, it sounds like a lot of these ships are crewed by species that were conquered by the beings who call themselves eternal shepherds, and they're asking for our protection rather than trying to negotiate with their supposed gods." Jake looked around his damaged bridge at his exhausted but victorious crew and realized that they had just struck a blow against an empire that had ruled hundreds of worlds through deception and mental manipulation rather than true divine authority. The aliens who claimed to be gods had been revealed as mortals who could be beaten by courage and determination and superior technology wielded by people who refused to bow down to false divinities. The battle was over, but Jake knew that the war had just begun as news of their victory spread through the galaxy and reached the ears of other species, who had been waiting for centuries for someone to prove that their supposed gods could bleed and die, like any other creatures born of flesh and metal and dreams of dominion over others. 6 months after the battle that shattered the myth of divine invincibility, the galaxy had become a very different place as species that had worshipped the eternal shepherds for centuries began to question everything they had been taught about their place in the cosmic order. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of a space station, orbiting one of the former subject worlds, and watched ships from dozens of different species arriving to participate in the first Galactic Freedom Council, where representatives would discuss how to build a new future without false gods ruling over them. The USS Defiance had become the most famous ship in human space and probably in the entire galaxy as news of their victory spread from world to world, carried by traders and refugees and former servants of the Empire who were finally free to speak the truth about their supposed divine masters. Jake found himself uncomfortable with the hero worship that followed him wherever he went, but he understood that people needed symbols of hope and resistance to help them rebuild their shattered worldviews. Lisa Carter had been promoted to chief science officer for the entire human fleet and was leading research teams that were studying the technology and social structures of the fallen empire to understand how such a massive deception could have been maintained for so many thousands of years. Her reports were being read on worlds across the galaxy as species tried to identify the warning signs that might prevent them from falling victim to similar deceptions in the future. Ryan Torres now commanded his own ship and was leading security patrols that protected former subject worlds from the remaining eternal shepherds who refused to accept that their time as false gods had ended. Many of the beings who had claimed divine authority were struggling to adapt to a universe where they were just another species trying to survive among equals rather than rulers, who expected automatic worship and obedience from everyone they encountered. The space station hummed with activity as delegates from hundreds of worlds worked together to establish new trade, relationships, and mutual defense agreements that would replace the forced unity that had been imposed by the Empire. Jake could see through the viewing ports that ships of every imaginable design were docked at the station's many arms as species that had been kept separate by their divine rulers finally had the chance to meet and learn from each other. Kelly Brooks had been assigned to lead the navigation division that was mapping safe routes between the former subject worlds now that the Empire's rigid control systems had collapsed and left many species isolated and uncertain about how to contact their neighbors. Her teams were working around the clock to establish communication networks that would allow free exchange of information and ideas, instead of the filtered propaganda that had been distributed by the Empire's central authority. Amanda Foster was serving as the head of the new galactic communication network that was being established to ensure that no single group could ever again control the flow of information between worlds. Her background in understanding alien languages and communication protocols made her invaluable in developing systems that could handle the incredible diversity of species and cultures that were emerging from centuries of enforced conformity. Tony Martinez had been put in charge of the technological exchange programs that were helping former subject species adapt technologies that had been forbidden to them under the Empire's rule. The Eternal Shepherds had deliberately kept their subjects dependent by limiting their access to advanced technology, but now these species were free to develop their own solutions to the challenges of space, travel, and planetary management. Jake received a message that one of the surviving Eternal Shepherds wanted to meet with him privately, and after consulting with his security team, he agreed to the meeting out of curiosity about what these fallen gods might have to say now that their empire had crumbled and their subjects had learned the truth about their mortal nature. The being who arrived at the meeting was nothing like the glowing energy creature that had first contacted the Defiance, but rather a frail-looking humanoid who seemed ancient beyond measure. The former god introduced himself as Veltar and explained that he had been one of the leaders of the Empire during its final years when they had become so dependent on the worship of others that they had forgotten how to actually govern or innovate or adapt to changing circumstances. He spoke of how the Empire had started with good intentions to bring order to a chaotic galaxy, but had gradually become corrupted by the ease of ruling, through deception rather than earning respect through wisdom and justice. Your species has done something that we thought was impossible," Veltar said in a voice that carried the weight of centuries of regret and lost opportunities. "You have shown the galaxy that authority must be earned rather than simply claimed, and that no being or species has the right to rule over others through lies and manipulation, no matter how advanced their technology or how ancient their civilization." Jake listened to the former god's words and found himself feeling something approaching sympathy for beings who had become trapped by their own success and forgotten what it meant to be part of a community rather than rulers standing above it. The Eternal Shepherds had created a prison for themselves, just as much as they had enslaved other species, and now they faced the challenge of learning how to live as equals in a galaxy that no longer feared or worshipped them. The meeting ended with Veltar asking if humanity would be willing to help his people find a new place in the galaxy as productive members of the galactic community rather than as conquerors or rulers. Jake promised to consider the request but made it clear that any such help would come with conditions, including full transparency about their past actions and genuine efforts to make amends to the species they had deceived and exploited. As Jake returned to his quarters on the space station, he thought about how far humanity had come from their first tentative steps into space to becoming the catalyst for galactic liberation. The victory over the Eternal Shepherds had shown that no empire built on lies could stand forever against the truth, and that ordinary people with courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds when they refused to accept that their freedom was not worth fighting for. The galaxy was entering a new age where species would stand together as equals rather than kneeling before false gods, and Jake knew that humanity would have an important role to play in building the institutions and relationships that would make that future possible. The USS Defiance had shattered more than just an empire when it opened fire on those crystalline ships, because it had also shattered the belief that some beings were destined to rule, while others were meant to serve, and that simple truth would echo through the centuries to come as the foundation of a truly free galactic civilization.